Assalamu alaikum. Today we are going to discuss about James Joyce's conception of novel The Stream of Consciousness. First of all, I would request from all my viewers to subscribe my channel and press the like button below. Here is our introduction of James Joyce's conception of the novel. James Joyce is a pioneer in the field of the modern novel, although technically he may not be credited with being the innovator of the stream of consciousness technique. We can see some of the features of this technique clearly reflected in a portrait of the artist as a young man as well as in Ulysses. The term stream of consciousness is derived from modern psychology and denotes the free association of art in the human mind, just as the water of a stream carries on its surface a variety of objects without any link or relevance between them. The novelist who uses this technique does not tell us what the character is thinking but takes us, as it were, into the very mind of the character. What is thus presented is called the interior monologue or a direct quotation of the mind. The modern novel, using this technique, stresses the present moment as the meeting place of the past and the future. Stephen, who also says in the portrait, the past is consumed in the present, and the present is living only because it brings forth the future. Use of epiphany and myth. Two distinctive features of Joyce's conception of the novel are the place that he gives to the epiphany and the myth. And epiphany in Joyce's novel is a sudden revelation of spiritual significance which makes its impact on a person at a moment of crisis. It is as if a veil is lifted and one is able to see the essential quality or unity of some idea, event, or person. Such a spiritual breakthrough could be triggered by something as insignificant as a sound or a gesture. Joyce uses Greek and Eastern myths frequently in his novel. He was interested in meaning which the myth embodied. He drew from these ancient and timeless stories and manipulated them to suit his own aesthetic purpose in order to deepen the dimensions of his character. There is great mythic content in Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake than in the portrait, but even in the last named novel, the myth of Daedalus and Icarus is important for realizing the full significance of Stephen Daedalus' story. Interior monologue. The portrait foreshadows the technique of the stream of consciousness novel. Melvin Friedman believes that this loosely autobiographical novel continues the poetic tendency of the dead. It is a kind of lyrical biography with the structure determined as much by the caprices of the developmental sensibility of the artist as by the growth of Stephen that lasts from infancy to young manhood. There is little in Joyce's previous work to prepare one the surprising first paragraph, which is not bracketed by quotation marks, although it is excerpted from a story being read to the infant Stephen. Once upon a time, and a very good time, there was a Mugo coming down along the road, and this Mugo that was down along the road met a nice little boy named Baby Tukum. One is aware immediately of Joyce's method. His intention is to quote from the mind of an infant. The style of the remainder of the first chapter parallels Stephen's development from infancy to boyhood. The chapter reads like an extended interior monologue through the indirect presentation of the third person. One can determine Stephen's age at a given moment by the construction of the sentences and by the maturity of the language. Just after his arrival at Clongowes Wood School, there is this passage of reflections of a boy about 6 or 7. It would be nice to lie on the hearth rug before the fire, leaning his head upon his hands, and think on those sentences. He shivered as if he had cold, slimy water next his skin. That was means of wills to shoulder him into the square ditch because he would not swoop his little snuff box for well seasoned hacking chestnut, the conqueror of 40. How cold and slimy the water had been. A fellow had once seen a big rat jump into the scum. Mother was sitting at the fire with Dante waiting for Bridge to bring in the sea. She had her feet on the fender, and her jewelry slippers were so hot and they had such a lovely warm smell. Dante knew a lot of things. She had taught him where the Mozambique Channel was, and what was the longest river in America, and what was the name of the highest mountains in the moon. Father Arnold knew more than Dante because he was a priest, but both his father and Uncle Charles said Dante was a clever woman and a well read woman. And when Dante made that noise after dinner and then put up her hand to the mouth, that was her heartburn, wish fulfillment. And the mind of the boy Stephen is depicted with entire objectivity. We see, for example, how reality gives place to fantasy and wish fulfillment. Until the sentence beginning, mother was sitting, the thoughts are entirely concerned with the present happening. Stephen unfortunate encounter with the school bully. Then there is a sudden change in setting to a moment in the past, occasioned by the child irresistible impulse in warm himself. This is prepared by the opening sentence, which expresses the wish realized imaginatively 4 sentences further on. Joyce has not yet eliminated the stage directions. One can still follow a clear development in the mind of the monologuer. The thought of mother and Dante sitting together extends the digression to Dante's expert tetralogue. The comparison between Father Arnold as instructor as at Longoswood and Aunt Dante is not quite enough to refocus Stephen's mind on the present situation. In fact, it occasions a further aside about a peculiar characteristic of Dante. The wish fulfillment, to use a favorite expression of Freud, is sufficient in this instance to distract the reverie from the unpleasant encounter. By a series of associations in his mind, Stephen is able to tip the balance in favor of a cherished memory. Trip to the pet. One example of psychological realism is seen in the case of Stephen, who daydreams and carries himself into the past. According to Friedman, the child's sureness with his medium is really the subject of this first chapter. Whenever the young Stephen feels the urge, he can conveniently transplant himself to some moment in the past. Often reality and imagination becomes hopeless confused. The thought of returning home or the holiday is sufficient to produce the event in Stephen's reverie. One is convinced that he is at home until the monologue is suddenly interrupted. All the people welcome home Stephen, and noises of welcome. His mother kissed him. Was that right? His father was a marshal now, higher than a magistrate. Welcome home Stephen, noises. There was a noise of curtain rings running back along the roads, of water being splashed in the basins. There was a noise of rising and dressing and washing in the dormitory, a noise of flapping of hands as the prefect went up and down, telling the fellows to look sharp. The transition from the scene created by Stephen imagination to the scene of objective detail is cleverly managed by the insertion of the word noises, which is part of each tableau. The first chapter is thus precariously balanced between the conflicting tendency of the Stephen's mind, now oriented towards the vagaries of the imagination, now brought back forcibly to the details of the Viking world. This is the first genuine use Joyce makes of his combined gifts as poet and novelist. In the first chapter, especially, he succeeds in reducing the novel of analysis to an enumeration of the movements of the sensibility, the stream of consciousness and the portrait. The stream of consciousness technique is evident more in Ulysses and Finnegan Wake, but it is seen at work in the portrait also. The opening section of a portrait of the artist as a young man is written in something very close to the latter stream of consciousness method. Indeed, there is a resemblance in technique between these pages and the Nausicaa episodes of Ulysses. Both use the device of indirect interior monologue. Although the writing is entirely in the third person, there is a genuine attempt in each instance to reproduce the mentality of the character. The first chapter of A Portrait of the Artist presents Stephen Dedalus as the environment impinges directly on his consciousness. The mind of the infant and young boy is opened on a strange, very new experience which his consciousness does not just yet subject to questioning, selection, or judgment. Indirect narrative in Stephen Hero and to some extent in the portrait. Joyce uses the technique of the traditional 19th century, such as the aside. The following chapter deserts this region and rely almost entirely on objective detail. The style changes from the chastened impressionism of the opening pages to a fuller and more rhythmical prose, which seems much closer to indirect narrative than to stream of consciousness. In the second chapter, Stephen has a fairly lengthy personal first person monologue, which is diligently prefixed by the customary 19th century apology. He could scarcely recognize as his own thoughts and repeated slowly to himself, I am Stephen. Stephen Dedalus. I am walking beside my father, whose name is Simon Dedalus. We are in Cork, in Ireland. Cork is a city. Our room is in Victoria Hotel. Victoria and Stephen and Simon. Simon and Stephen and Victoria names. This reverie is set in relief to the passage of narrative preceding and following it. There is a concerted effort to distinguish it stylistically from the other writing in the chapter, which partially explains the reduction of this monologue to its simplest terms. Stephen's mind in this instance is presented far less complexly than in the first chapter, where the monologues flow more naturally into the narrative passages. The convention of the 19th century novel of considering of the monologue as a non-structural side which has to be dispatched artistically with as little pain as possible seems to be revived here for the last time. The associations built on a pattern of self identification appear oversimplified. Only the final synthesis of the three names is convincing as inner monologue. Purple passages. Joyce's conception of the novel evolved continually, as can be seen in the change of Stephen Hero in the portrait. However, there is still some evidence of immaturity in the portrait, especially as regards simple purple passages. Although the style of the novel changes with the increasing maturity of Stephen Dedalus to make for an interesting fusion between character and design. The method finally sinks into the artifice when the full rhythm of the chapters devoted to adolescence reaches a kind of crescendo in the opulent writing of the final pages of the fourth chapter. The technique seems a trifle forced. This epiphany scene is in which the pure fleshly beauty of the bathing girl arouses Stephen's sensuality is mirrored by a king of fin de Sicil rhetoric, which seems far removed from the stream of consciousness writing of the opening chapter. This is how the description of the girl beauty read. Her bosom was as a bird soft and slight and soft as the breast of some dark plumaged dove, but her Long fair hair was girlish, and girlish and touched with the wonder of mortal beauty her face. She was alone and still gazing out to sea, and when she felt his presence and the worship of his eyes, her eyes turned to him in quiet sufferance of his gaze, without shame or wantonness. Long she suffered his gaze, and then quietly withdrew her eyes from his and bent them towards the stream, gently stirring the water with her foot hither and thither. The first faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence. Low and faint noise of gently moving water broke the silence. Low and faint and whispering, faint as the bells of sheep, hither and thither, hither and thither, and a faint flame trembled on her cheek. The Joyce of Ulysses could have intended this passage only as pastiche. Indeed, it reminds one a bit of Gertie McDowell's flirtation with Bloom, described in terms borrowed from an Ethel M. Dell novel, observes Melvin Friedman. Conception of language. The most remarkable thing about Joyce's conception of the novel is his view of language, for he believed that ordinary language was inadequate. One of the oldest theme in the novel, according to Dorothy Van Kant, is that language is a creator of reality. There is this theme in in the novel of this writer is supremely a man animated by the word, and as the words he has read in books send him into action, creating reality for him by determining what he sees and what he feels and what he does. So Quixote is in turn has similar effect upon other people, subtly changing their outlook, creating in them new forms of thought and activity. Don Quixote may be looked on as an extensive investigation of the creative effects of the language upon life. Joyce's portrait is also an investigation of this kind. Appropriately, so far the artist whose youthful portrait the book is at the end to find his vocation in language and the shape of reality that gradually defines itself. For Stephen is a shape determined primarily by the association of the words we follow in the circumstances of the boy life, the stages of breakdown and seizing confusion in his external environment as his home goes to pieces, and the correlative stages of breakdown in his inherited values as his church and his nation lose their authority over his emotion. Very early, the child mind begins to respond to that confusion by seeking in itself, in its own mental images, some unifying form to or forms that will signify what the world really is, that will show him the real logic of things, a logic hopelessly obscure in external relation. His mental images are largely associations suggested by the words he hears, and in intense loneliness he struggles to make the associations fit into a coherent pattern. To the very young child, adults seem to possess the secret of the whole, seems to know what everything means and how one thing is related to another. Apparently in command of that secret, they toss words together into a sortic compound. Some words whose reference the child knows, and many whose reference are mysterious, and the context of the familiar ones, the unfamiliar ones, thus taking on their meaning for him in the wondrously accidental and chaotic fashion. These accidents of context, however bizarre, build up his notion of reality and determine his later responses and the bias of his soul. There is the story that Stephen's father tells him about a cow coming down along a road. There is a song about the wild rose blossoming on the green place. Stephen, is evidently the licensed little boy towards whom the cow designs its path, and Stephen, can make the wild rose into a green one by a transposition of the adjectives. The world's form then is apparently shaped towards him and out from him as its center. But how to put the story and the song intelligibly together in a superior, meaningful pattern of reality, with his father's hairy face looking at him through a glass? or with the clear smell of the oil sheet, or with Dante's two brushes, or with Eileen, the neighbor girl, who was a different father and mother, or with some guilty things he has done for which he must apologize. Else, Eagle will pull out his eyes in his extremely short sequence at the beginning of the book. The child's sense of insecurity in a world whose form he cannot grasp is established, and with insecurity, guilt, with these uncompromising emotional elements, grasps his world imaginatively as a shape within which he has a part that is essential to its completeness and harmoniousness and meaningfulness. In Ulysses and Finnegan Wake, the language is still more experimental than in a portrait of the artist as a young man. Now, our next topic is James Joyce's conception of art and beauty, how he has used this technique in his novel by writing, while he was writing the novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. So let us start from its introductory passages. In A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, as well as in Ulysses, we come across a recent view on the nature of art and beauty. Taken together, they form a more or less coherent aesthetic, though it is to be remembered that the aesthetic is basically that of fictional character, Stephen Dedalus, and not that of Joyce himself. For example, there are several drawbacks in Stephen's theory which it would be unfair to impute to Joyce himself. Still, the views of Stephen have a bearing on those of Joyce, though they must be interpreted cautiously and refer to the statements of Joyce made outside the novel. Art and Aesthetic. S. L. Goldberg cautions us about approaching Joyce's aesthetic too theoretically. To approach Joyce's art theoretically through his aesthetic is not without its dangers. The commonest mistake is to take that aesthetic as a sort of criterion, a point of reference by which to measure Joyce's artistic success. Probably every reader of modern literature has met Stephen Dedalus' theory in The Portrait and his view on Shakespeare and Ulysses, and it seems only natural to apply Shakespeare in Ulysses, and it seems only natural to apply Joyce's own aesthetic in the criticism of his books, if not of all literature. The fact is, however, that the real value of the aesthetic theories is of a different kind, for it is always dangerous to judge a writer's work by his own theories. We tend only too easily to beg the most relevant questions, and these dangers are particularly acute when, as in Joyce's case, the theories appear as an integral part of complex work of art, but if they cannot supply us with a critical yardstick or even a useful structure of the author's intention, they can help us, I believe, in another way. If we are prepared to follow them patiently and critically, they lead us directly towards the preoccupations and the forms of his imagination. Joyce and Stephen. The main interest of the aesthetic theory in the portrait, he points out, arises from the fact that it brings many of the themes of the novel itself to a convenient focus, in particularly both the kind of attitudes that subtly impel Stephen all through it and the limitations of those attitudes as well. The theory is primarily Stephen's, not Joyce, even though Joyce has used many of his own ideas in it, and to examine it is largely to examine Stephen as a dramatic character. The theory therefore offers a convenient starting point for a critical discussion of the art. Yet, even while it does so, it offers peculiar difficulties of its own. Joyce's view. It is interesting to compare Joyce's view stated explicitly with those found in the novel. If we examine these various theories in relation to each other, it quickly appears that those in the novels are more highly wrought, more developed than anything that survives of Joyce's personal comments. It is understandable enough that Stephen's remarks in the portrait should have led to an inclination of their value as a general aesthetic and some not very convincing applications of them to Joyce's work. But even on a casual reading, Stephen's character in the portrait ought to provoke a certain caution about his theories. His emancipation from his society, for example, is clearly less assured than he supposes, and despite his citation of Aquinas in support of his aesthetic, the forms in which his imagination actually expresses itself seem more like those of a late 19th aesthete than a tough minded 20th century New Thomas. He is obviously not to be identified with the artist as an older man. If we look at Joyce's other novels, moreover, we also notice that Stephen is portrayed with far less irony in Stephen's hero and with a far more complex irony in Ulysses. This general differences is reflected in the differences between the theories he propounds in each work. Differences important not only for their theoretical implication but also for their dramatic implication about the novel in which they appear. In other words, if we put the theory and the portrait side by side with those in the notebooks and Joyce's other writings and Stephen's hero and press certain problems they raise, we can hardly avoid concluding that the theory Stephen advances is the portrait is not a satisfactory aesthetic in itself, that it forces in the novel is not so much philosophical as dramatic, and that it awaits a completion and a rectification by the views he advances in Ulysses. The theory in the portrait serves to reveal not too much the nature of art as the nature of Stephen Dedalus, and to miss this or to attempt to assess Joyce's work by theory as he there presents in it is inevitably to distort his artistic achievement. This is a very pertinent reminder against identifying Stephen and his conception of art too closely with Joyce and his conception of art. Defective assumptions. S. L. Goldberg draws attention to some common assumption with which people approach Joyce's conception of art, presupposing that whatever is applicable to Stephen is equally applicable to Joyce himself. He believes that before examining the theory, it is probably as well as to clarify right at the start two or three other common assumptions about it and about Joyce's art. The first is that whatever difficulties we find in Stephen's view, Joyce's own theory is all of a piece and was so from the very beginning, and that to discover what it is all we need to do so simply find the common denominators in his various formulations, supply the assumption that will reconcile them together and interpret the results to taste. The second assumption is that this underlying specifically Thomist or New Thomist, and that what Stephen Dedla says in various places is correctly interpreted as what Aquinas meant or what others have since constructed on a foundation of his ideas. Both assumptions are highly questionable. To take only one example, it is true as any examinations of the theories quickly reveals that the notice of what Joyce called epiphanies, which is touched on in Stephen's hero, but nowhere else and never explicitly developed, is essential to any aesthetic attribution to Joyce himself. It is also true that the theory in the portrait is crippled by the omission of the concept, while the more satisfactory theory in Ulysses depend upon it. But the concept as it is assumed in Ulysses is rather different from the form in which it is mentioned in Stephen's hero, and if we wish to understand Joyce's own views, we ought to take that difference into account. We may, for whatever reasons, prefer the early formulation with its vaguely metaphysical flavor, but we cannot reasonably presume that it represents Joyce's own real and always consistent view. But the real importance of this is its beating on the second assumption. Although the notion of the epiphanies is of central importance, some critics have tried to add it to Joyce's other aesthetic theories by supplying him with a gratuitous metaphysical system and interpreting epiphanies as well as the terms Stephen explicitly borrows from Aquinas in a fully scholastic sense. Despite his scholastic terminology, Joyce's aesthetic is not strictly Thomist at all, nor is there any real evidence of whatever that he gave any of his aesthetic terms a theological meaning, or that he intended at any stage to reveal through art the ordered spiritual vision of Christianity. He may never have cast off the effect of his religion, even though he rejected it or escaped the influence of his Jesuit teachers. On the other hand, his reading in Aquinas seems to have been private and idiosyncratic, and certainly not undertaken in pursuit of a Catholic philosophy. Joyce was never a philosopher of any kind, and we must not reel too much into what he actually wrote for the sake of making it consonant with what we perhaps feel he ought to have written. Thus, many of the preconceptions about the equating Stephen's view with those of Joyce have to be cast off. Theological analogies. It has been rightly pointed out that Stephen's theological analogies need to be approached with caution when considered with reference to Joyce. Another temptation closely connected with this is to overemphasize Stephen's theological analogies. In the course of his discussion, both in the portrait and again in Ulysses, he compares the artist with God, and though there are insights which his analogies are designed to illuminate, it is well to insist that his analogies are only analogies, not identifications. He is not arguing from art to religion, as is something sometimes thought. He is advancing aesthetic doctrines, not metaphysical. When he compares the limited autonomy of art and of the human artist to the autonomy of God, we ought not to suppose that his metaphor elevates the one to the place of the other or was meant to. Again, if he sometimes uses phrases or doctrines to doubtful religious orthodoxy, this may perhaps shock some people, but it does not necessarily invalidate his point about art. The foundations of this his theory do not lie in his theological analogy, which are more expository devices than experiential premises, and we have to ask that purpose they serve. What point Stephen is really making before assuming that his unorthodoxy is a dramatic hint from Joyce that his character's theory is completely wrong. The difficulty with Stephen's theory, indeed, is that they are not wrong in any simple black and white sense at all. He is always at least partly right. The weaknesses are a matter of his emphasis, what he neglects, what he overstresses, what he therefore distorts. Art and life. It is quite appropriate that a moot point in Joyce's aesthetic, as found embodied in his novels, is the relation between art and life. At bottom, S.L. Goldberg tells us both Joyce and Stephen are concerned with one main set of aesthetic problems. The relations between art and life are between the artist as man and the artist as artist. These are inevitably among the central problems of any aesthetic in the post-modern romantic era, and they admit of no easy universal solution. On the one hand, the desire to dissociate art and life has an obvious motive and an obvious validity. A work of art is not properly the direct expression of social or personal attitudes, and not therefore to be estimated simply as a social or psychological or moral phenomenon. It exists in its own right and demands a response in its own terms. On the other hand, the desire to relate art and life is no less necessary and no less valid. A work of art is a human artifice, and it necessarily exists in social contexts. Looking back over the various attempts of the last century and a half to satisfy these apparently conflicting impulses, we may at least say that either impulse alone is likely to emasculate art or to pervert its integrity unless checked by the motives and insights that prompts the other. The difficulties of the artist himself is coming to terms with a society that all too crudely demands his service or all too easily provokes his rejection. Difficulties from which perhaps no significant artist since Blake has been free serve only to heighten the theoretical confusions. Joyce himself offers a classical example of the issues, and all the more so, since he was so conscious of them and tried in the dramatic figure of Stephen Detlas at once to present them and to work out a solution. And although the terms in which he did so can be assessed only in the detailed analysis of the art, these issues constitute the broad underlying significance of Stephen theorizing, and particularly of the most marked change of emphasis discernible between the views in the portrait and those in Ulysses. The portrait and Ulysses. It would be useful to relate Stephen's view in the portrait to those in Ulysses and to note the significance of the change of viewpoint and emphasis. In the former novel, Stephen is intent and dissociation of art and life on the autonomy and integrity of the work of art in itself. In the course of his argument, however, he conspicuously estimates the other side of the matter, the positive relation between the work of art and the life from which it springs, which it impinges on in others and which it expresses in its own terms. The result is that what he says is largely disabled by what he omits. As it stands, his theory lapses all too readily into a barren formalism, encouraging a purely internal analysis of works of art, a concentration on their pattern of organization to the exclusion of question of imaginative depth and value. Indeed, to view Joyce's own art through the theory in the portrait would lead to just that kind of formalistic analysis and evasion of judgment. It has received from some of its commentators up to the point Stephen's supplementary theory of aesthetic forms, lyrical, epical, and dramatic, is an attempt to fill this gap. But insofar as it remains strikingly inconsistent with his more so far as it remains strikingly inconsistent with his more extended and obviously more personally important the theory of beauty and art. The theory of forms really foreshadows what he attempts in Ulysses. To understand it fully requires a context largely than that provided by the portrait alone. But this being the case, it is also quite clear that the views in Ulysses makes no complete break with the earlier ones. On the contrary, they partly assume them even while they reveal their inadequacy. And just at the crucial points, indeed, where we might expect the immature and incautious Stephen to be inadequate. Consequently, it does not in itself form a completely satisfactory aesthetic either. Its greater strength lies rather in its correction of the earlier unbalance, its firmer, its firmer grasp of subtle, complex relations of art, artist, and society, an insight that theoretical though it is, nevertheless marks a significant shift from one book to the other. Neither book must be approached in isolation. Shortcomings. There are three major interrelated problems that Stephen fails to solve in his theory and the portrait, problems that arise from the reflect his wider attitudes. The relation between aesthetic value and the moral value, the difference between aesthetic beauty and natural beauty, and the relation between aesthetic form and aesthetic meaning. In each case, to follow out his ideas is to find ourselves reach the impasses of his immaturity. To a great extent, these issues are resolved in Ulysses, where Stephen is again the central character. On the whole, the aesthetic theories of Stephen in the three works, Stephen's Hero, a portrait of the artist as a young man, and Ulysses, have an important bearing on Joyce's own view, though they are certainly not to be equated with him. Now, this is the end of our uh, learning that is related with Joyce's conception of stream of consciousness, a technique in a portrait of the artist as a young man, and the art of beauty, how he uses the art of beauty in his novel. So now this is it for today. Hope so you like my video. Next we shall discuss and come with some new few points. Till then, take care and don't forget to remember me in your good prayers, and don't forget to subscribe my channel as well. So till then, take care and Allah Hafiz.